A cat is walking down a sidewalk in Washington, D.C. Nothing unusual about that. Cats do that. It's basically their job description. This cat, however, has a microphone surgically implanted in its ear canal, a radio transmitter wired into the base of its skull, and an antenna running the length of its tail. This cat is also a 5-year, $20 million espionage program funded by the United States government. This cat is also about to get hit by a taxi. Yeah, we're doing this one. That cat, ladies and gentlemen, cost more than most fighter jets, took 5 years to build, and died approximately 5 minutes into its first field test. No sequel, no redemption arc, just a very expensive cat and a taxi driver who will never know what he did. So, why did the CIA turn a house cat into a listening device? Why did nobody stop this? And why, 40 years later, are we still finding out new ways this was worse than we thought? Let's get into it. Quick context, because you need to understand the room this idea was pitched in. It's the 1950s and 60s. America and the Soviet Union are not technically at war, they're just spending unlimited amounts of money trying to out-paranoid each other. The CIA has a budget that answers to almost nobody. A mandate to counter Soviet espionage by any means necessary. And this is the important part, basically zero adult supervision. This is the same agency around the same era that tried to poison Fidel Castro's cigars, dosed its own employees with LSD without telling them to see what would happen. That one was called MK Ultra. It's a whole other video. It's genuinely one of the darkest things a government has done to its own people in peacetime. And I promise you it makes the cat look tame by comparison. Considered a plan to make Castro's beard fall out to humiliate him publicly. That was real. That got meetings. So when I tell you the agency approved a $20 million cyborg cat with a straight face, understand that this was, comparatively, a normal Tuesday. The bar was on the floor. The bar had been surgically removed, much like the cat's free will. This is the environment Operation Acoustic Kitty was born into. A place where let's put a microphone inside a live animal wasn't the craziest pitch in the room. It might not have even been the craziest pitch that week. The idea, on paper, actually made a certain kind of unhinged sense. Soviet diplomats liked to talk in parks, outside embassies, anywhere they assumed wasn't bugged. Nobody suspects a cat. Cats are everywhere. Cats are furniture with opinions. So, weaponize the furniture. Here's what CIA engineers actually did to this animal. And I want you to sit with the fact that grown adults with security clearances signed off on every step of this. A microphone was implanted in the cat's ear canal. A small radio transmitter was placed at the base of its skull. A wire antenna was threaded the entire length of its tail. And this is the detail that always gets me. Because the surgery disrupted the cat's normal urge to hunt for food, they had to go back in and wire a separate device just to suppress its appetite, so it wouldn't wander off chasing a bird mid-mission and blow the whole op for a sparrow. We built a machine to stop the robot cat from being distracted by being a cat. The project reportedly took about 5 years and, depending on the source, somewhere in the ballpark of $20 million, which today is well north of $100 million. For reference, that is serious military hardware money. That is, we could have built several actual airplanes money. Instead, we built one cat. The engineers, by every account, were completely earnest about this. They weren't in on the joke, because from where they were standing, there wasn't one. This was cutting-edge signals intelligence. This was the future of espionage. This cat was, professionally speaking, about to be the most surveilled and least self-aware operative in agency history. So, 5 years of surgery, training, and taxpayer money later, it's time for the real-world test. The target. Soviet officials talking outside their embassy in Washington, D.C. Exactly the kind of conversation this whole program existed to intercept. The plan? Park a surveillance van nearby. Release the cat. The cat casually strolls over, sits near the diplomats, and its onboard hardware quietly relays every word back to the van. They open the door. They release the cat. The cat immediately wanders into the street. and gets hit by a taxi within moments of the mission starting. 5 years, tens of millions of dollars, brain surgery on a house cat, appetite suppression hardware so it wouldn't get distracted by a pigeon, and the actual first and only field deployment ended before the cat made it across one street. Because it turns out you cannot override CAT with wiring. This is, adjusted for inflation, one of the most expensive workplace terminations in the history of American intelligence. And the termination was a Buick. There are competing accounts of exactly how it happened. Some say it was hit almost immediately upon release. Some place the failure slightly later in the op, but every version of this story ends the same way. The mission is over in minutes, and the only thing that got intercepted was the cat by traffic. Here's the part that turns this from funny cat story into something a little darker. The program was quietly shut down. No congressional hearing, no public reckoning, just filed away. We only know most of this because a CIA officer involved in the project, Victor Marchetti, discussed it years later, and because documents were eventually declassified. Decades after the fact, long after anyone could be held remotely accountable for it. Nobody got fired over this in any meaningful sense. Nobody had to explain to the American public where $20 million went. The institutional response to "we spent a fortune on a doomed cyborg cat" was silence, followed by more silence, followed by declassification once it was safely a punchline instead of a scandal. And that's really the through line of this whole era. The cat isn't really the story. The cat is the symptom. The actual story is what happens when an institution has unlimited money, a blank check of secrecy, and nobody in the room whose job it is to say, "Should we?" instead of just "Can we?" You get exploding cigars. You get LSD tested on unconsenting citizens. And you get a house cat with a $100 million surgical bill, dead in the road before it clocked in. None of this was a rogue engineer going off script. This was the system working exactly as designed. A system with essentially no brakes. So that's Acoustic Kitty. A 5-year, multi-million-dollar fever dream that ended in under a minute, buried for decades, and now mostly remembered as a fun bit of trivia instead of what it actually was. A pretty clean example of what unaccountable power does with a blank check and zero oversight. It's funny. It's allowed to be funny. But it's worth remembering that funny and an actual government agency mutilated a house cat as an act of geopolitical strategy can both be true at the same time. In the entire history of the Central Intelligence Agency, thousands of people have been promoted, decorated, and quietly retired with pensions for far less impressive work. The cat got none of that. The cat, as far as we know, is the only member of the entire program that never got a promotion. So that happened. And look, I've got bad news and worse news. The bad news. That's not even close to the dumbest thing humans have done with power, money, or a complete lack of adult supervision. The worst news. I've got centuries of this. Empires collapsing over hurt feelings. Wars started over paperwork. Entire civilizations undone by one guy's terrible idea and nobody in the room willing to say maybe not. History is just an endless highlight reel of "it seemed like a good idea at the time," and I intend to cover all of it. So if you want front row seats to humanity repeatedly failing upward, hit subscribe. It's free. Unlike most of the decisions in this video, it costs you nothing and nobody gets hurt. Smash the like button. Consider it your one contribution to a system that's actually kind of fair, unlike literally everything you just watched. And send this to one friend who deserves to know how catastrophically stupid their species can be. It's basically a public service. See you next time. Try to learn something. Try harder not to repeat it.